The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of Crestview Academy, casting long, golden rectangles across the polished mahogany floors. It was the kind of light that usually inspired hope, but for Kenji Sato, it only illuminated the frayed edges of his blazer sleeves. He stood at the front of the classroom, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. In his trembling hands, he held his final capstone essay, 20 pages of his soul poured onto paper, exploring the intricate layers of his Japanese heritage and the quiet dignity of his father's life. He had spent months on this, fueled by nothing but black coffee and the desperate hope that this paper would secure his early admission to Harvard. Mrs. Beatrice Sterling didn't even look up from her tablet as he approached her desk. The sharp scent of her Chanel No. 5 hung in the air, thick and suffocating, creating an invisible barrier between her world of luxury and his world of survival. She let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing minute, the only sound being the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant, muffled laughter of students in the hallway. Finally, she extended a hand, her manicured nails clicking against the paper as she snatched it from him. She flipped through the pages with a bored, dismissive flick of her wrist, her eyes darting over the words not with interest, but with a predatory search for a mistake. She stopped abruptly on page 4. A cold, thin smirk played on her lips, the kind of look a scientist might give a particularly interesting insect before pinning it to a board. She tossed the essay onto her desk as if it were contaminated. It slid across the smooth surface and fell onto the floor, the white pages fanning out like a broken wing. Kenji flinched, the sound of the paper hitting the ground echoing in the silent room. "I'm sorry, Kenji, but I simply cannot accept this," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern that felt like acid. "It's quite a bold move, really. To think you could just submit professional level work and expect me to believe you wrote it. People from your background don't typically possess this level of linguistic nuance. Who did you pay to write this for you? Or did you just feed a prompt into an AI and hope I was too old to notice the difference?" Kenji felt the blood rush to his face, a hot wave of humiliation prickling his skin. "Mrs. Sterling, I wrote every word of that," he stammered, his voice small but steady. "I have all my rough drafts in my bag. I have my research notes from the library. I can show you the time-stamped versions on my laptop. I worked on this every night after my shift at." She cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand, her diamonds catching the light and momentarily blinding him. "Don't lie to me, boy. It's insulting to my intelligence. It's one thing to be a scholarship student living on the charity of this institution, but it's quite another to be a thief. Academic dishonesty is a stain that doesn't wash out." A low, guttural chuckle came from the doorway. Mr. Henderson, the gym coach, leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He wore a Crestview varsity jacket that looked a size too small, and his eyes were filled with a mocking glint. "You heard the lady, kid," Henderson said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Maybe you should stick to things that come more naturally to your people. You know, like the physical stuff. I saw your dad out by the bleachers this morning scrubbing gum off the concrete. He's got a real talent for it. Maybe you should go help him instead of trying to play philosopher." The words felt like a physical blow to Kenji's stomach. He looked at Mrs. Sterling, hoping to see a flash of reprimand for the coach's blatant cruelty, but she only smiled, a thin, approving line. She picked up a thick red marker and, with a flourish of theatrical arrogance, drew a massive, jagged F across the cover page of his essay. "This is a failure, Kenji. Not just for the assignment, but for your character," she sneered, leaning forward until he could see the coldness in her blue eyes. "I've already contacted the disciplinary board. A scholarship is a privilege, not a right, and we don't give privileges to frauds. Consider your future at Crestview over. Now, pick up your trash and get out of my sight." Kenji knelt down, his fingers brushing the cold floor as he gathered his papers. He could hear the first bell ringing, signaling the end of the period and the beginning of his nightmare. As he stood up, clutching the ruined essay to his chest, the honors class began to filter in. He saw the wealthy legacy students, the ones who had never worked a day in their lives, looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. He felt like a ghost in his own life, a shadow being erased by a woman who didn't even know his middle name. He walked toward the door, his head bowed, but as he passed Mrs. Sterling, he paused for just a fraction of a second. His eyes caught hers, and for a fleeting moment, the timid boy disappeared. Behind the pain and the shame, there was a spark of something freezing and absolute, a silent vow that this was not the end, but the beginning of a reckoning she would never see coming. The memory of the village in Japan felt like a dream from a different lifetime, one painted in colors that had long since faded into the gray reality of the present. 25 years ago, Hiroshi Sato was not a man who smelled of industrial bleach and floor wax. He was a rising star in the world of architecture, a man whose hands drew blueprints for glass towers that touched the clouds. He had a home filled with the scent of jasmine tea and a future that seemed as vast as the Pacific. But that future was stolen by a predatory Western firm that had used his brilliance to secure a multi-billion-dollar contract, only to discard him through a series of legal loopholes and corporate betrayals that left him penniless and shamed. When Hiroshi moved to America, he didn't come for the glitz of the big cities. He came for a second chance for his newborn son. He had researched every school in the country and set his sights on Crestview Academy. He knew he couldn't afford the tuition, so he took the only job they had available, the graveyard shift as a janitor. For 2 decades, he had scrubbed the toilets of the elite and buffed the floors of the wealthy, all while keeping his head down and his dignity intact. Every blister on his hands and every ache in his back was a payment toward Kenji's future. He had raised his son to believe that education was the only weapon the world could never take away, a shield that would protect him from the cruelty of men like the ones who had ruined Hiroshi. The flashback shifted to a younger Beatrice Sterling, long before she became the terror of the English department. She was a girl raised in a world of silver spoons and ironclad prejudices. Her father, a man who measured human worth by the zip code of their primary residence, had sat her down in their sprawling library and pointed to the gardener outside. "Remember, Beatrice," he had said, sipping an expensive scotch, "there are people who build the world, and there are people who clean it. Never confuse the two. If you let the help believe they belong at the table loses its value." That lesson had hardened in her heart like cold concrete, turning into a lifelong mission to protect the purity of institutions like Crestview from those she deemed unworthy. Back in the present, the cold air of the school hallway snapped Kenji back to reality. He watched through the glass pane of a classroom door as his father, Hiroshi, moved slowly with a heavy mop. Hiroshi's shoulders were hunched, and a sudden, wet cough racked his chest, a lingering reminder of the harsh cleaning chemicals he had breathed in for 20 years to keep this school pristine. He looked older than his years, his hair a shock of white against the drab blue of his uniform. Kenji felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of intense love and burning rage. His father had given everything so that Kenji could stand in classrooms where he was currently being branded a thief. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He remembered the nights they had sat at their small kitchen table, counting nickels and dimes just to make sure there was enough gas in the car to get to school. He remembered his father's pride when Kenji received the scholarship letter, the way the old man had wept silently, believing the cycle of poverty had finally been broken. As Kenji stood there, he realized that Mrs. Sterling wasn't just failing a student, she was spitting on 20 years of a father's labor. She was trying to prove her father right, that the janitor's son would never be anything more than a janitor. Kenji tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. He looked at his father's shaking hands as he wrung out the mop, and then he looked toward the administrative wing where Mrs. Sterling was likely already filing the paperwork to destroy his life. The hidden truths of their past were no longer just memories, they were the fuel for a fire that was just beginning to burn. Hiroshi had told him that education was a weapon, but as Kenji watched his father suffer in silence, he realized that sometimes, you have to use that weapon to strike back. The time for being the polite, grateful scholarship student was over. If the elite of Crestview wanted to play a game of power, Kenji was finally ready to show them that he knew exactly how the board was built. The following morning, the atmosphere at Crestview Academy had curdled. Mrs. Sterling wasn't content with merely failing Kenji, she wanted him erased. She had marched into the principal's office before the first bell, flanked by Mrs. Gable, the head of the PTA, A woman whose face was pulled so tight by plastic surgery and bitterness that she looked permanently offended by the existence of the working class. Mrs. Sterling sat with her legs crossed, swinging a designer heel like a pendulum of doom, as she laid out her fabricated evidence. She claimed she had found a leaked copy of the final exam in Kenji's locker, a blatant lie that she delivered with the practiced sincerity of a stage actress. Mrs. Gable chimed in, her voice a sharp, nasal whine that cut through the quiet room like a serrated knife. "It's about the integrity of our children's environment," she insisted, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "We pay 6 figures in tuition so our children don't have to compete with thieves and liars. This boy is a bad seed, and frankly, I'm concerned about the security of the building with his father lurking around the hallways at night." The principal, Dr. Aris, a man who seemed to have traded his spine for a steady paycheck, sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't even look Kenji in the eye when the boy was summoned. The decision was already made. The injustice felt like a physical weight in the room, a thick, suffocating fog. Kenji stood in the center of the office, his hands balled into fists at his sides, realizing that no matter how much logic he presented, he was invisible to them. He was just a variable in a social equation that needed to be removed. Even his supposed friends, kids he had tutored for free in the library for years, were suddenly nowhere to be found. He saw a few of them through the glass partition, looking away or checking their phones, terrified that the stink of his disgrace might rub off on their college applications. The humiliation reached its peak during the lunch hour. Mrs. Sterling had insisted that Kenji clear out his locker immediately, and she made sure it happened right as the hallways were at their most crowded. She stood over him like a warden, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "Make it quick, Kenji. I'm sure you're used to packing up and moving on," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to the crowds of whispering students. "We need this space for a student who actually belongs here. You were a mistake on this school's record, and I am just the eraser." Behind her, Coach Henderson leaned against a trophy case, chuckling as he watched Kenji shove his worn textbooks and a single, faded photo of his mother into a tattered backpack. In the corner of the hallway, Sarah, the quiet girl who worked as the librarian's assistant, watched the scene unfold with wide, watery eyes. She clutched a stack of books to her chest, her knuckles white. She knew Kenji was innocent. She had seen him in the library every single night, buried under mountains of research, his brow furrowed in concentration while the rest of the school was at parties. She had the security logs that showed him entering and leaving the stacks, but as Mrs. Sterling shot her a warning glance, a cold, sharp look that promised professional suicide if she spoke up, Sarah looked down at her shoes. She remained a silent witness to the theft of a young man's dignity. The final blow came an hour later. Kenji's father, Hiroshi, was summoned from the basement. He arrived in his blue janitor's coveralls, his face smudged with a bit of dust, looking confused and weary. "Dr. Aris didn't even offer him a seat. Because of your son's criminal behavior and the breach of trust," he began, his voice devoid of any human warmth, "your continued presence here is a liability. Crestview is terminating your employment effective immediately. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises." Hiroshi stood there, the news hitting him like a physical shove. He looked at Kenji, then back at the principal, his voice a cracked whisper. "But sir, I have worked here for 20 years. I have never missed a day." Dr. Aris simply looked down at his desk, dismissing them both with the silence of a man who had forgotten what it was to have a heart. Kenji and his father walked out of the grand iron gates of Crestview Academy for the last time, carrying their lives in 3 heavy trash bags. The sky had turned a bruised, metallic gray, and a cold drizzle began to fall, soaking into their clothes. They stood at the bus stop, 2 shadows of men discarded by a world that valued zip codes over character. Hiroshi's hands were shaking as he gripped the plastic bags, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Kenji felt a scream building in his throat, a roar of pure, unadulterated rage against the unfairness of it all. He looked at his father, the man who had sacrificed every ounce of his strength for a dream that was now lying in the gutter, and he felt a cold, hard resolve take root in his soul. This wasn't the end, it was the moment the victim died and the hunter was born. The bus ride home was a hollow, echoing silence, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the cracked pavement and the occasional hiss of the air brakes. Kenji sat with his head against the cold, vibrating window, watching the manicured lawns of the Crestview Heights dissolve into the weathered, neon-lit landscape of the lower city. His father, Hiroshi, sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the floor. The heavy silence between them wasn't one of defeat, but of a massive, shifting weight. When they finally reached their cramped apartment, the smell of old wood and ginger greeted them, a humble sanctuary that now felt like a cage. Hiroshi didn't go to the kitchen to start the tea. Instead, he walked to the back of his closet and pulled out a small, battered metal safe box that Kenji had seen only once in his childhood. Hiroshi sat on the edge of his bed and beckoned Kenji over. His movements were no longer the slow, weary gestures of a janitor. There was a sudden, sharp precision in his hands. He punched in a code and the lid clicked open. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a heavy, ornate golden key and a thick stack of legal documents bound in a faded blue ribbon. "Kenji, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Hiroshi said, his voice dropping an octave, regaining a resonance that Kenji hadn't heard in years. "For 20 years, I have allowed them to see me as a servant. I have allowed them to treat us as if we are invisible. I did it to protect you, and I did it to wait out a clock that they didn't even know was ticking." He pulled out a document embossed with a seal Kenji recognized instantly, the Crestview Estate Trust. "When I lost the firm in Japan, I didn't lose everything," Hiroshi continued, his eyes locking onto Kenji's with a fierce intensity. "I took what remained of my family's inheritance and I bought the land. Not the school, but the very dirt it sits on." The 99-year lease agreement they signed with the previous owners had a clause. It stated that if the land changed hands to a direct descendant of the Sato line, and that line was ever mistreated by the institution, the lease could be terminated with 30 days' notice. "I spent 20 years working as their janitor to keep an eye on them, to see if they were worthy of the land I provided. Today, they proved they are not." Kenji felt the air leave his lungs. The golden key in his father's hand wasn't just a trinket, it was the master key to the entire estate. He looked at the papers, the deeds, the titles, the legal victories won in secret over 2 decades of quiet litigation. He realized then that while he was studying for exams, his father had been playing a much larger game. The humiliation he had felt in Mrs. Sterling's classroom began to transmute into something cold and crystalline. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was the landlord. He was the owner. He was the power that could dismantle everything Sterling and Gable held dear. The mindset shift was instantaneous. Kenji stood up straighter, his chest expanding as the weight of poverty seemed to evaporate from his shoulders. He didn't feel like crying anymore. He felt like planning. Instead of reacting with the hot, impulsive anger of a teenager, he felt the calm, calculating chill of a strategist. "Dad," he whispered, looking at the golden key, "we can't show them yet. If we reveal this now, they'll just find a way to tie it up in court. We need more than just the land. We need to catch them in the act. We need the evidence of what Sterling has been doing to all the scholarship kids." Hiroshi nodded slowly, a grim, knowing smile touching his lips. "You are my son. You have the mind of an architect. You see the structure before the building is even there." Kenji took the papers and spread them out on the small kitchen table, the yellow light of the overhead bulb making the legal text dance. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a hunter. He began to map out the next 7 days with the precision of a master builder. He would play the part of the defeated boy for just a little longer. He would let Sterling celebrate her hollow victory. He would let her think she had swept him away like dust. Meanwhile, he would reach out to the one man who owed his father a life debt, a high-powered attorney who specialized in civil rights and corporate takeovers. The long game had begun, and as Kenji looked at his reflection in the darkened window, he didn't recognize the timid boy from that morning. He saw a man who was about to bring an entire empire to its knees. The following week at Crestview Academy was draped in a deceptive calm. Inside the brightly lit teacher's lounge, the air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the shrill, self-congratulatory laughter of Beatrice Sterling. She sat perched on a velvet armchair, holding a porcelain cup with her pinky extended, basking in the glow of her perceived triumph. Finally, she sighed, a sound of pure satisfaction. It's like the air in the East Wing is literally thinner now that the janitor and his little protege are gone. I honestly don't know how we breathe with that kind of element loitering in the halls. Coach Henderson let out a boisterous laugh, leaning against the counter as he stirred 3 sugars into his coffee. You really did the school a service, Beatrice. Principal Aris was always too soft. You handled that situation like a true professional. It's a clean slate just in time for the gala. Sterling smirked, checking her reflection in the back of a silver spoon. Standards, coach. That is what separates us from the rest of the world. Standards. While Sterling celebrated her hollow victory, Kenji Sato was a ghost in the city, moving with a silent, lethal purpose. He didn't spend his days mourning his lost scholarship. Instead, he spent them in the glass-walled offices of downtown law firms and in the quiet, dusty corners of the city archives. He sat across from his father's old contact, a man named Marcus Thorne, who was widely considered the most feared civil rights attorney in the state. Thorne looked at the stack of documents Kenji had compiled, the bank statements, the land deeds, and the dozens of testimonies Kenji had quietly gathered from former students who had been bullied out of the school by Sterling. This is a massacre, Kenji, Thorne whispered, his eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. You don't just have a case. You have the leverage to burn that institution to the ground and rebuild it in your own image. Kenji didn't smile. He just nodded. I don't want to burn it down, Mr. Thorne. I want to take back what belongs to my father. The grind was exhausting and surgical. Kenji worked 16-hour days, fueled by a cold, steady fire. He made secret phone calls to disgruntled board members who had been silenced by the PTA's influence. He met with Sarah, the librarian's assistant, in a crowded subway station where she handed over a thumb drive containing years of grade alteration logs. Every night, he returned to the small apartment where his father sat at the kitchen table, meticulously reviewing the lease termination clauses. They were like 2 architects designing a trap so perfect, the prey wouldn't even know it had been caught until the cage door locked. Back at school, the villain's arrogance had reached its zenith. Sterling spent her afternoons at high-end boutiques, picking out a gown for the upcoming Legacy Gala, convinced she was about to be named vice principal. She walked through the hallways of Crestview with the gait of an empress, snapping her fingers at the new cleaning crew and making snide remarks about the lack of order. She was so blinded by her own narcissism that she didn't notice the way Principal Aris began to avoid her gaze in the hallways. She didn't see the panicked phone calls being made in the administrative offices or the way the school's legal counsel was suddenly working through the night. On the final night of his preparation, Kenji stood on the sidewalk across from the academy, watching the maintenance crews hang the massive banners for the gala. He looked at the golden Crestview emblem and thought about the decades of his father's sweat that had gone into those floors. He thought about the red F Sterling had slashed across his heart. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold, heavy weight of the golden key. The trap was set. The legal filings were signed. The silent ally was ready. The world saw a boy who had been defeated and cast aside, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kenji knew that the next time he walked through those gates, he wouldn't be looking for a seat in a classroom. He would be coming for the keys to the kingdom. The evening of the Crestview Legacy Gala arrived with an oppressive sense of opulence. The grand ballroom was a shimmering sea of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the stifling scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Outside, a line of black limousines stretched down the cobblestone driveway like a funeral procession for common sense. Beatrice Sterling stood near the center of the room, draped in a floor-length emerald silk gown that cost more than a janitor's annual salary. She held a flute of vintage champagne, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced gaze of a general inspecting her troops. She was in her element, surrounded by the power players of the city, the donors, the politicians, and the legacy parents who viewed the world through the same distorted lens she did. Mrs. Gable, the PTA head, fluttered over to her, adjusting a diamond necklace that looked heavy enough to choke her. Beatrice, darling, the room is buzzing, she whispered, her voice a sharp, eager trill. I heard a rumor that the board is making the vice principal announcement tonight. It's practically a coronation. Sterling offered a smug, thin-lipped smile, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the rim of her glass. It's simply about restoring the natural order, Tiffany. Quality over quantity. We've finally cleared out the debris, and now the school can breathe again. She laughed, a high, brittle sound that rang out over the soft swell of the string quartet. Nearby, Coach Henderson was holding court with a group of wealthy fathers, leaning in to deliver a joke about the help that sent the group into fits of boisterous laughter. The atmosphere was thick with a toxic sense of belonging, a fortress of privilege built on the exclusion of others. But just as the clock struck 8, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The music didn't stop, but the conversation began to wither like a dying vine. Kenji and Hiroshi Sato walked into the light. They weren't wearing the uniforms of servants, nor were they trying to blend in with the Western tuxedos of the elite. They were dressed in traditional Japanese formal attire, heavy, high-quality silk hakama and haori in shades of deep indigo and charcoal. They moved with a synchronized, quiet power that commanded the space. Hiroshi stood with his back straighter than anyone had ever seen it, his gaze level and unafraid. Kenji walked at his side, his eyes burning with a cold, focused fire. The silence that followed them was deafening. Beatrice Sterling froze mid-sip, her glass hovering inches from her lips. The color drained from her face, replaced instantly by a blotchy, indignant red. She set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray with such force it nearly shattered. She began to march across the floor, the rhythmic click-clack of her designer heels sounding like a firing squad on the marble. "Are you absolutely insane?" she hissed as she reached them, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. She didn't look at their faces, she looked at them as if they were a stain on her carpet. "How dare you show your faces here? This is a private event for the stakeholders and families of this institution. You are trespassers. You are nobodies. Security," she screamed, her voice cracking as she frantically signaled to the guards near the door. "Get these janitors out of my sight before I have them arrested." The crowd began to press in, a circle of judgmental eyes and whispered insults. Mrs. Gable stood just behind Sterling, her face contorted in a sneer of pure disgust. "This is unbelievable," Gable barked, waving her phone as if it were a weapon. "The audacity of some people. You were fired for a reason. You're a thief and a fraud, Kenji. Do you think wearing a costume changes that?" Coach Henderson stepped forward, puffing out his chest to intimidate the smaller boy. "Take the hint, kid. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of before this gets ugly. You don't belong in this room. You don't even belong in this zip code." Kenji didn't flinch. He didn't look at Henderson, and he didn't look at the security guards who were now closing in. He looked directly at Beatrice Sterling, his expression one of calm, terrifying pity. The security guards reached out to grab Kenji's arms, but a sharp, panicked voice rang out from the stage at the front of the room, stopping them dead in their tracks. "Wait, stop, don't touch them." It was Principal Aris. He was standing behind the podium, his face the color of ash, his hands shaking so violently that the papers he held rattled against the wood. He looked at Sterling, then at the Satos, and he looked as though he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear forever. Beatrice looked up at him, her expression one of impatient confusion. "Principal Aris, what are you waiting for? Do your job and get this trash out of here." Aris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Beatrice, please, shut up," he whispered, his voice cracking over the microphone. The room went stone cold. Sterling's jaw dropped, her eyes bulging. Kenji took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving toward the stage. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, the atmosphere shifting from mockery to a sudden, chilling realization that the world as they knew it was about to end. Kenji reached the podium and held out his hand. Without a word of protest, the principal stepped aside and handed him the microphone. The feedback from the speakers hummed through the ballroom, a low, electric growl that signaled the end of the old world. Kenji stood at the podium, his silhouette framed by the golden Crestview crest, but he didn't look like a student anymore. He looked like the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Beatrice Sterling stood at the base of the stage, her face twisted in a mask of fading arrogance. This is a joke, she barked, her voice reaching for a power that was rapidly slipping through her fingers. Principal Aris, I don't know what kind of breakdown you're having, but get this boy off that stage right now. This is my night. Kenji leaned into the microphone, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the weight of 20 years of silence. You're right about one thing, Beatrice. It is a night for stakeholders. But you've been mistaken about who they are. He reached into the pocket of his charcoal houri and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folder, tossing it onto the podium with a thud that echoed like a gavel. My father didn't just spend 2 decades cleaning these floors. He spent 2 decades owning the ground they were built on. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the lease for Crestview Academy has been officially terminated for gross violations of the ethical and moral clauses. You aren't standing in your school anymore, Beatrice. You're standing in my father's house. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Gable's hand flew to her throat, her pearls clacking together as her mouth hung open in a silent O of horror. The big screen behind Kenji, usually reserved for displaying the names of million-dollar donors, suddenly flickered to life. But it didn't show names. It showed a spreadsheet. Rows upon rows of names, scholarship students, mostly Asian, Black, and Latino, next to their actual test scores and the adjusted, failing grades signed by Beatrice Sterling. The color didn't just leave Sterling's face, it seemed to evaporate, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent gray. Her champagne glass tilted, the liquid spilling over her emerald silk dress, but she didn't even notice. I was maintaining standards, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. These are lies. You forged this. You're just a bitter little boy trying to ruin a woman's career. Kenji's eyes didn't soften. He tapped a key on the laptop next to him, and a recording began to play. The audio was crystal clear. It was Sterling's own voice, recorded by Sarah in the library, laughing with Coach Henderson about how easy it had been to plant the exam in the janitor kid's locker to keep the scholarship fund pure. The room went deathly silent as the recording finished. Even the most hardened socialites turned away from her, the stench of her downfall suddenly more offensive than any poverty they had ever looked down upon. Kenji looked at his father, who stood at the foot of the stage, his arms folded, his dignity radiating like a sun. Then, Kenji looked back at the woman who had tried to erase his future. You didn't fail me because of my work, Beatrice. You failed me because you couldn't imagine a world where the person cleaning your floor could also be the person who owned your chair. You called me a mistake. But today, the mistake is being corrected. Principal Aris stepped forward, his head bowed. Mrs. Sterling, Coach Henderson, security will escort you to your offices to pack your personal belongings. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. We will also be cooperating fully with the district attorney's office regarding the civil rights violations and the academic fraud discovered in these files. Sterling tried to speak, her mouth moving like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Coach Henderson tried to make a break for the side exit, but 2 police officers, who had been waiting in the wings, stepped into his path. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. As Sterling was led away, her heels no longer clicking with authority but dragging across the floor her victim's father had once polished, she looked back one last time. She saw Kenji standing tall, not with a look of triumph, but with the quiet, tired peace of a man who had finally brought his father home. The applause didn't start right away, it began as a slow, hesitant beat from the back, where the catering staff and the younger scholarship students stood, until it grew into a roar that shook the crystal chandeliers, celebrating a justice that had been 20 years in the making. The weeks following the gala felt like a slow, cleansing rain washing away years of accumulated grime. The headlines were relentless, detailing the fall of the Crestview Queen, as Beatrice Sterling's career evaporated in a firestorm of lawsuits and public disgrace. She was stripped of her teaching credentials and forced to settle multiple civil rights cases that bled her dry. Coach Henderson faced criminal charges for his role in the evidence tampering, and the school's board was completely restructured. But for Kenji and Hiroshi, the real change was quieter. It was found in the way they walked through the front doors of the academy, now renamed the Sato International Institute, not as workers or outliers, but as the architects of its new soul. Hiroshi was appointed as the director of operations, a role where he finally traded his mop for a desk and a voice in every major decision. He didn't want revenge, he wanted to ensure that no other father would ever have to watch his child be humiliated for the crime of being poor. 5 years passed in a heartbeat, yet the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. Kenji Sato stood at the edge of a public park in the heart of the city, the cool autumn breeze tugging at the edges of his tailored overcoat. He was a prominent civil rights attorney now, known for defending the very students the system tried to forget. As he walked toward his car, he noticed a woman in a bright orange safety vest, hunched over a trash picker. She was struggling with a heavy plastic bag, her hair matted and her face lined with a bitterness that no amount of time could soften. It was Beatrice Sterling, fulfilling the final hours of her court-mandated community service. She looked up as he approached, squinting against the sun. For a second, a spark of the old arrogance flickered in her eyes, a ghost of the woman who once ruled Crestview with an iron thumb. But then she recognized him. The color drained from her face, and she looked down at her mud-caked boots, clutching the trash bag as if it were the only thing she had left in the world. She looked small. She looked exactly like the help she had spent her entire life despising. Kenji didn't gloat. He didn't offer a biting remark or a smug smile. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card for a local community center that offered job placement and humble, honest work. He placed it on the bench beside her. "Everyone deserves a chance to build something real, Beatrice," Kenji said, his voice soft but resonant with the wisdom of a man who had seen both sides of the curtain. "But you have to be willing to start from the ground up." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the middle of the park she was forced to clean. As he drove back toward the school that bore his family name, Kenji looked at the city through the windshield and felt a profound sense of peace. He realized then that the greatest lesson his father had ever taught him wasn't found in a textbook. It was the truth that power is a fleeting shadow, but character is an anchor. We are often told not to judge a book by its cover, but the deeper truth is that some people are so busy judging the cover that they never realize they are being written out of the story entirely. Karma isn't a hammer that falls from the sky, it is simply the harvest of the seeds we choose to plant. And as the gates of the Institute opened for a new, diverse generation of thinkers, Kenji knew that the harvest was finally good.